Okay, we are just about ready. We will to now begin session 6. We have session 6 from now until 3 o'clock. Then we'll have a half an hour break, and then we will have our final session of the conference. This session is titled The Intersection of Multiple Identities and Mental Illness on Campus, Race, Culture, Religion, and Sexual Orientation as Compounding Sources of Stigma.
Welcome everyone to our panel. Can folks hear me in the back? Yes? Raise your hand if you can hear me in the back. Oh, good. All right.
Kirsten, I'm sorry. And we'll continue to do questions. We'll have a SAC scholar here. So please, when you do have a question, just wave it so Sam will see you and be able to come over, and you'll put your question in the basket. Thank you.
So welcome again. My name is Kirsten Chan. I'm a counseling psychologist or clinical psychologist at the Counseling Center at Cal State Long Beach. And it's my pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleagues here on this panel. So I'll share them with you both here and then also for those of you in the back. Let me see if I can get this to work. Okay, very good. To my right is my colleague, Dr. Abbasi. She's a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and also in the Muslim Studies program, and also a staff psychiatrist at the Olin Health Center at Michigan State University. So very pleased to have her here with us. And next we have Brenda Ibanez. She's a student and a motivational speaker at California State University, Long Beach. And Dr. Leaks, do you want to wave your hands? Oh, well, they know what you look like because of the photo. That was silly of me. All right, clinical staff psychologist and group therapy coordinator at the Engelman Student Health Center at the University of Southern California. And Carla Schurd, that's not actually a statue of her, that's her university, but that would be really cool. If you have a statue, you have to send us another photo and we'll put that up there instead. She's a coordinator of services at the Mental Health Center at Gallaudet University. And last but not least, Dr. Nicole Weeks, Associate Dean and Professor of Neuroscience at Pomona College. And just as a reminder, if you're dying to know more about my esteemed colleagues, the bios are all listed in the program that you had received earlier. Oh, and this is me. So before we get started with the questions, which you'll see in a second, just to go over the structure a little bit, we did have some discussion questions that we thought were interesting, but as Dr. Benke mentioned, if there's questions that you have, we definitely want to hear those as well, and so we'll be receiving the comments from Dr. Benke when you hand your cards in to the SAC scholars who are circulating. So please do share those. We want this to be as interactive as possible. And so you might be wondering, maybe you're not, but perhaps you are, why this topic? Why is it important? We think we all kind of agree diversity is generally important, but perhaps we could talk a little bit more in depth about how this might affect, say, assessment and manifestation of symptoms and treatment. So I'll give you 3 scenarios. Let's say you're a clinician and you have a student come in and he talks about being followed everywhere. Everywhere he goes, people are following him. They're looking at him. They're looking at him suspiciously. They ask him if he needs help. You know, we might kind of start to wonder, is this person paranoid? Are they having psychotic symptoms? But what if I told you this person lived in a predominantly white neighborhood and they happen to be African American? And the place that they're being followed is in a mall. Or they're a Muslim American student and they're being followed in an airport and everyone's staring at them, or there's just been some kind of incident. Say the Boston bombing marathon, and people are following them around there. Does that change our assessment of their symptoms? Could that be more healthy cultural paranoia or cultural mistrust, right? Second one, you have a student come in, and she's talking about the ghosts in her house and how they're talking to her, and they're telling her things, and some of them are angry and some of them are happy. Might start to get concerned, right? But what if she comes and then says, you know, my mother's always talking about how there's a ghost. She's Asian American. Second generation, my mother's always talking about how there's spirits and everything, and we can't go out at certain times, and someone just died, and we can't go out if I have dreams because the spirits might take me away to the other side. but then she tells you other things that concern you. Is this just her cultural belief? Or are there psychotic symptoms? Or could it be both? Could her cultural beliefs affect the manifestation of those cultural symptoms? Right? Third example, what was my third example? Oh, okay. So you have a student who comes in and they talk about how their family is unsupportive of their treatment with you, and that's of concern. And instead, they're taking their daughter to a place where perhaps they pray over her and light incense and candles, and perhaps they have different kinds of objects that are believed to be sacred. And, might I think that this is an unfortunate situation because the parents are not being supportive of her mental health treatment, that they don't care about her? Well, but what if her parents are immigrants from, say, Mexico, and this is their cultural belief, and they truly believe they want to take their daughter to a cleaner or cleanser to give them the proper kind of care for the symptoms that she's having, right? So these are just a few examples of why we all want to be here today, and I know my colleagues have even probably more examples of things, but that's just kind of the framework in which we're discussing this, not just because it's good for us, but because this really could affect the assessment and the treatment and the manifestation of symptoms. Couple of caveats. I don't know about you all, but I don't know everything there is to know about everything. My other thought, the caveat I wanted to throw out there, we have an hour and a half, which is a good amount of time, but we probably won't have every diversity discussion that we're ever supposed to have in this time here. But what we can, I think what you will see is, an honest and full engagement and a commitment to learn from each other and to lean into discomfort and learning from you all as well. And perhaps the way to address that is to continue having these conversations after session 6 and after we leave USC and go back to our respective places. So with that, let's start with one of the first questions. And we can go in any order. So what we'll do here is raise our hands when, this is just for us to communicate with each other a little bit better. Raise our hands when we have a question, and then we'll go ahead and speak. So the first question is, for any of our panelists, what would you like the audience to take away from this panel? Farha? Dr. Abbasi?
Farha is fine. Actually, by now I should be Farha. It's like a aha.
That's okay. So in my culture, we call people by doctor, so I can't help myself.
So being on this panel is very interesting for me because I describe myself as a woman with 3 strikes against her. So I'm a Muslim, I'm a woman, and I'm a psychiatrist. Talk about stigma. So I think I would like to focus on why religion, faith-based mental initiatives are important, especially when you are assessing. In the assessment, I want to focus particularly on that one thing. I'll give you an example of one of my patients. So this is a 40-plus old male. He has multiple admission to inpatient unit, psychiatry unit, with the diagnosis of resistant depression. And he is has failed all medical intervention, is receiving electroconvulsive therapy, which is the last thing we try on a patient. So it is called ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, which is the extreme intervention. So while I was a resident at that point. So my attending is talking to this patient and is telling us how he's suffering and we can't find the cure. Something in his demeanor I picked and I said, this is a Muslim guy. And I went and looked at his history and it said Christian. And I was like, that's interesting because his gestures, some things he said, I could say he's Muslim, I could pick on it. So once my attending was not there, I went to him and I said, Assalamu alaikum, which is, God, peace be with you, or our way of... and he immediately said, wa alaikum salam, but then he stopped himself and said, please do not tell anyone that I'm Muslim. So I was like, okay, why would you do that then? So it turns out he was part of Iran-Iraq war. He was an Iraqi soldier. And in that war, he killed 2 Irani soldiers and then could not live with the fact that being a Muslim, he has killed 2 other Muslims. And he got so disillusioned that he wanted to leave the country. So he contacted a local church there, a Christian charity group, and they converted to Christianity and they brought him to America. When he came here, the Iraq war happened. Iraq war happened. So now he's here. His family does not know that he has converted. But because his family has not converted, the family cannot come here. And he does not feel safe to let anybody in the Muslim community know that he has converted. But so he's being supported by the church. He was wearing really good clothes. There were people coming from church, bringing him food. So he was being supported, but nobody was getting to the heart of his isolation and the source of his depression. So while he has been here, his brother was killed, his niece was threatened at a school, and he has no way to communicate and know exactly what's going on at any given day. So to me, that spoke a lot, that how important it is to look at the whole picture. And once when I was able to relieve his fear, which was very genuine, that, Muslim community here will not hold it against him, or we can still connect you to cultural resources without being judged about it. He was a changed person. Just listening to a familiar music, eating familiar food, talking the language, he was a different person. So that is why I think religion becomes important. Another example I would like to say, and quickly I will move to the other, is language. So imagine I sit here and I say, "Aapne kya khaya? Aap kahan se aaye? Aapne kyun kapde pehne hue hain? Aapne aaj kya kiya sare din mein?" Did you guys understand? No. So for most of our foreign graduates, we could be using the very good clinical skills and doing wonderful, thorough interview. This is what they're hearing. Right? So language, culture, it becomes really important. So again, I say there are certain universal laws and universal things and structure that is important, but always look at the person as an individual, and always focus your clinical intervention based on that one person. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Weeks. Yes. So first of all, can everyone hear me? Everyone here in the back? Okay. So I want to start out just thanking Dr. Sachs, because she's a hero of mine. She doesn't know it yet, but she'll know it at some point. So I really appreciate it. I'm very honored. The other thing that I wanted to say is I don't want to compete with Farha, but look at me. So I'm a black female neuroscientist in the administration at Pomona College. And I also have an Axis 1 diagnosis of episodic depression, right? And so one of the things I'm really interested in is having the audience have an appreciation of the intersectionality and the complexity of diversity, right? So there are diversities that are apparent and quite visible, or you imagine them to be, right? So you look at me, and there's some phenotypic characteristics that are obvious. And you, like me, make assumptions based on that, based on the fact that I'm black, right? You all have a set of assumptions. They may be different assumptions from one another, but you have those assumptions. Based on the fact that I'm a woman, there are particular assumptions you have. Based on the fact that I'm a neuroscientist, there are particular assumptions that we each make. Based on the fact that I have an Axis 1 diagnosis, there are particular assumptions that we make. And so one thing that I would really appreciate, I would say, both for the clinicians in the room and for the school administrators, is just to take a step back sometimes and think about your own positionality, right? Think about how you define yourself, and then think about how that might affect the way in which you define or the assumptions that you make about others, whether those are students or clients or even your coworkers for that matter. So One, I would say that. So if I could get one thing across to the administrators and the clinicians in the room, it would just be a reminder of where each of us comes from and how critical that is. And to the students, I would say, never give up, right? Never give up on your academics. Never give up on finding help, because you'd be surprised how much help there is out there. But sometimes it's an issue of connecting those of us who are now in a helping role to those who are in need of help. And sort of, again, not only looking at your own positionality, but looking at the positionality of the people around you and how that might be relevant to your own care and also to our own care. And I'll just stop with that for now.
Thank you, Dr. Weeks.
Absolutely.
Anyone else?
I can go.
Dr. Weeks.
So it's
Dr. Weeks and Dr. Weeks here. I'll have to.
You know what? It's like
Dr. Weeks. Go ahead, please.
and I assume everyone can hear me. So it's definitely a pleasure being here, and I'm still trying to figure out how I got on this panel. So we'll ask the Institute what mistake they made.
Because you deserve to be here.
But no, I think one of the big take-home messages is diversity is important, and this topic is important, and we all in the room looks like a pretty sophisticated crowd, and we're all evolved. But I think that with the daily grind of our lives, just how busy things get, we can easily lose focus on this very important topic of diversity in general, but just the intersecting identities that we all carry. And so I hope that, you know, just this space would allow us to just pause and reflect on diversity and the intersecting identities and how it impacts our own work, our own personal lives, our professional work that we do, and then with the students that we interact with. I'm the group coordinator at the Counseling Center, but I also run a group as well. And we have pre-group meetings for all of the students, and so who are interested in groups, and so they come in for about half an hour. And the whole purpose is just to make sure that the groups are a good fit for what they're looking for. And, you know, I run the social anxiety group, and easily in a semester, I can, you know, have a meeting with 15 to 20 students, and they're just routine. You know, we try to get them in as quickly as possible so we can start the group, and we have a specific intake that we use in terms of criteria, and it just becomes rote and routine. And I remember working with a young lady, and she was describing some of her social anxiety difficulties and how it was difficult for her to talk to her classmates, to speak up in class, to even raise her hand, to even go and speak with her professors, and which is very classic, you know, presentation for a lot of the students in our group. And at the end of the meeting, you know, she happened to be Latina, and I told her, I'm like, well, you know, this might not be the case for everyone, but I'm wondering if your ethnicity plays a role in your hesitancy to raise your hand in class. And just a spark went off in her eyes, and she spent the next 5 minutes talking about how difficult it was to transition to USC, being a student of color, transferring in, coming from a low SES background. And if I didn't ask the question, I would have lost some really valuable information that would have really helped, you know, conceptualize what was going on for this young lady. It could have easily just fallen into a category of this is just classic social anxiety without taking into consideration some of the diversity factors. And I think about diversity all the time, you know, it's part of my life, and so it's really easy just to kind of fall into a routine and a rut. And so again, I hope that this will just cause us to pause and think about our identities and positions and how they impact the work that we do. And I would say, finally, it's interesting, there's factions or there's individuals who say, hey, they're waving their hands, they're jumping up and down, my identity is important to me, all the aspects of who I am are important, they impact my educational journey, they impact how I view myself. And please take this into consideration as you develop programs on campuses. Please take this into consideration as you develop curriculum for your courses. And I think, you know, some people hear that, but there at times seems to be this cultural, this institutional tide that tries to downplay it. It's like, oh, well, we're past that. You know, look, Obama's in office, or look, you know, we have look around you. You know, we have a lot of.
And he's Muslim.
Yeah, exactly. We have a lot of diverse faces, and I think that sometimes there's a mismatch between some of the stuff that's happening on the ground and how that interfaces with, you know, the bigger cultural institutions. And I think that sometimes students get a message that institutions or the university doesn't care. Couldn't be farther from the truth, but I think sometimes there's a gap in that communication process.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Sherry?
Gosh, there are so many things that I want people to be able to leave with, and I'm trying to narrow it down to 3 that I think are the most critical. I think I'm going to start with my own personal experience as a Black deaf female. Of course, you know, people first see me as a Black female. Deaf usually comes in later on once you come up to me and I can't hear people speaking. And I always feel like, you know, people avoid me, are friendly to me because I'm a Black female. Then when they find out I'm deaf, then they get lost. One example of that, if I can't hear people speaking, people always will say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and then they'll leave. It's like I'm not worth it, not worth the time or effort it would take to communicate with me. I'm like, we got pens and paper, we can communicate here, but instead I get, "Oh, I'm sorry." Like, you know, I was cursed by God, I was punished by God or something. And it's almost something that they want to avoid. And that's very common in the deaf experience, regardless of the race of the person. Yeah, we don't really need that apology because we're deaf. The second experience is when people say, "Oh, you're deaf, can you read lips?" And I'll say, "No, oh, obviously you can't read and write then." They'll assume that if I can't talk or read lips, that means I have no education. And the last one I wanted to mention was people making the assumption that I went to Gallaudet University to get my bachelor's degree. It's actually, I went to Howard University, and I graduated from Howard University. I was very successful there. I did very well. It was a hearing university, but I did very well, and people are very shocked to hear that. They say, "Oh no, if you're deaf, therefore you're supposed to go to Gallaudet University, where they have a large community of deaf people." I said, "No, I was the only deaf person in my psychology program at Howard." But there are a lot of assumptions people make about me. And I could have easily become discouraged. I could very easily have quit and just thrown my hands up at it and stayed at home and just not really been anything bigger than working at McDonald's. But it was important for me to fight. And many deaf people with mental illness have no energy to fight for their rights. So you really have to open the doors for them. If they come into your office and you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, you're deaf, I don't know sign language," they're lost. You've lost them. You know, you need to be able to provide services for them. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then as people here were talking earlier about language, ASL is more than just hand movements, more than just sign language. It includes facial expression, body language, eye contact. So when a deaf person's really excited about something, their signs will often become larger. And a lot of psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors interpret that as anger. And they think it might even be possibly a psychotic thing. They need to be taken to the hospital. And we're thinking, well, what's wrong? I'm just expressing my feelings here. So unfortunately, people have been sent to the hospital. Actually, let me back up in this. I'm going too far. If someone's depression and needs help and they're sent to the hospital, the doctor, psychiatrist, wherever, usually they'll try to look for an interpreter. They'll try to do the right thing. And if they can't do that, well, then let's just let the deaf person go home. Wow. And so now that deaf person gets more confused. They get depressed. You know, I went for help. I was told I was fine, and I was sent home. So apparently I must be healthy. So they get a false sense of understanding, and then they start not wanting to express themselves to anybody. So they ultimately don't get the help they need. Some end up killing themselves or become in a worse situation than they were before. And also talking about mental status, examinations, the MSEs. One has the proverb question, like the grass is greener on the other side. What does that mean? For some deaf people, that's not a proverb that they understand. They haven't had access to that sort of language. So unfortunately, the psychologist, psychiatrist will think, oh, obviously this is somebody who's psychotic or unintelligent or detached. No, it's just because that question came from a hearing world perspective that the deaf community doesn't have access to it. And so that's something that you just ultimately don't understand. Like I was just looking at Reader's Digest magazine, for example, and they talk about it raining cats and dogs. And well, in some other countries, I think one country said it rains like chairs or something. So each country has its own idiom for that idea. Each culture has its own representation of expressing that concept. It doesn't mean that they're smarter or not as smart or that they're not attached with the world. It's just a cultural aspect, and so it's part of our stories. That was me.
Thank you. I thought we could practice today. This is applause, right?
Yeah. Right.
Thank you so much. And I just so far really quickly wanted to comment. I'm hearing a lot of common themes around visibility and wanting to be seen and understood in context and appreciated. And definitely wanted to bring you into the conversation as well, Brenda.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Sachs, for allowing me to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Brenda, and I'm a person with schizophrenia. I guess what I would like the audience to take away that I didn't speak on yesterday was that sometimes when we're having episodes, psychotic episodes, it's very confusing for us, going through it, much less trying to explain it later in therapy. But what I would like, I guess, everyone to hear today is that there's a dire need for criminal rights defense for people who, while going through an episode, commit a crime or are accused of a crime and are incapable of defending themselves. Back in 1999, I was convicted of a crime because I ran into a 7-Eleven and was, I guess, assaulting the clerk to lock his doors because I was being persecuted. And I was arrested for assault. And that's on my record. It's on my permanent record, where when people want to hire me or give me an opportunity, and that's on my record, it takes away the opportunity for me to actually get a good paying job or even work for the government per se. So if any of you have it in you to fight and advocate for criminal defense for mental illness patients and who commit, I made a mistake. And it didn't matter in a court of law. And it's probably had to do with my cultural status. I was a female of Hispanic-looking origin, low income at the time, I guess. And I was just convicted. And maybe the initial interview that I had while I was detained, it was about a 3-minute interview. I don't think anybody could have assessed me that quickly and be able to defend me properly. So I want to speak on that today because I didn't touch it yesterday. And I think on a cultural realm, I'm sure that African Americans and Hispanic people are the ones that suffer the most when it comes to that. So I guess keep that in mind as you encounter people who, through their psychotic episodes or through their depression or any type of setback that they might have mentally, get in trouble. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. I'm hearing common themes about how do our various cultural lenses affect how we as people and our clients as people are being perceived. And I think that kind of ties into the next couple questions, which I'll actually combine, which is how might the multiple identities, the intersecting identities affect both stigma as well as resilience. And I'll stay on the resilience slide because I like that one the best. But we can address this in any orders. How might these intersecting identities affect both stigma around mental health issues, both by our providers and then also by family members, but then also how might they contribute to sources of resilience, strength? So anyone can raise their hand in any order. Dr. Abbasi.
So working with Muslim community, first of all, Brenda, to add on something, I have two students, Muslim students who are being deported. Mm-hmm. One has green card status and other was a refugee status. So they were imprisoned and then are being deported. And I'm trying to intervene on their behalf, but unfortunately there isn't much I can do because they are not legally an American citizen yet. So I realized I want to focus on resilience because I realized, like Brenda said yesterday, that finding God was what helped her in the end. So I realized in Muslim mental health, Muslim community, there's a very hierarchical structure. So if somebody is feeling sick, the first person they will go to is the elder in the family. And the second, the elder of the family would send them to the priest or imam or the chaplain. And then if they are really sick, they might go to a primary care with very somatic, vague symptoms. And so it would be very surprising if finally the primary care would refer them to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So we come very low in the chain. So I realized that problem. So when I started working in the community, I realized I had to go to the center of this hierarchical structure. So I started working with the imams and chaplains and training them as mental health aides. So the idea is not that they would be providing mental health care, but at least they should know what is happening and how to find the resources and connect them to the resources. So now I'm in East Lansing. So East Lansing Islamic Center and the Michigan State University, we all came together, and our local Lansing mayor, we all came together and created this supportive network for the students, in the sense that legally I have trained few people in the Islamic Center who are very aware of HIPAA. And now when I have a student who does not have a family or support system, the Islamic Center as a legal identity can step in, bring in the support system. It could be simply something like sitting with them, praying with them, or bringing some home-cooked food for them, or actually providing financial support too when it is needed. So I think faith can become a very strong source of resilience also. And this experiment that I did, we have been able to help a lot of students. And they turned, a simple small thing, somebody from Indonesia, her father was dying and she did not have the money to travel. So we combined the resources and sent her back. That turned around her life. Her depression was very situational. So just that kind of intervention and support. So I still think finding God and finding the resources can be really supportive and help with the resilience. Although with the Muslim culture, one thing is very interesting is what is psychosis and what is religiosity. So we are very used to talking to God and God talking back to us. So how do you differentiate? So I have this one simple thing I always talk to my students about is, it's okay if you are talking to God. That's religion. But if God starts talking to you, then that's psychosis. So
it's a good tip.
Yeah.
So I guess I would start with an observation, and that is when Kirsten sent us these questions, one of the things that I was thinking about is as a faculty member, so I've spent most of my 16 years at Pomona as a faculty member, and it's interesting to me the students who tend to come to me and why they tend to come to me. So my students of color, especially color in terms of marginalized groups, tend to come to me with academic or cultural adjustment issues, whereas I would say that my majority students are more likely to come to me with mental health issues. So I was thinking about this issue in terms of, is it something about, again, my own positionality that makes different people come for different reasons? And one of the things that really struck me when I was going through these questions was thinking, in some ways, you could think about students who come from marginalized groups, whatever that marginalized group is. We've already overcome, right? So the fact that they're in college is a sign that they have overcome, that they have resilience, right? And so the question for me, or at least something I'd like us to think about, is the fact that my students of color tend to talk to me less about mental illness. Is that about a cultural difference in comfort or what's seen as appropriate? Is that about an issue of resilience, that once you've overcome one type of marginalization, it may put you in another position in terms of overcoming other types of marginalization? So it's interesting, and I appreciate the question very much, because it really made me have to take a step back and ask that question. You can imagine a student. You can imagine students who are deaf, particular students who are deaf. You can imagine individual students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and from less prepared backgrounds. That's not necessarily the same thing. You can imagine students who come from marginalized ethnic groups. You can imagine individuals who come from marginalized gendered or sexual orientation groups. It's enough just to get us to college if everything else goes well. It's damn hard to imagine us in college if there's yet one more burden on our back, and that can be mental illness. So I think it's really interesting to think about in what ways, right, are we stronger, right, and therefore better able to cope, and in what ways is this just one burden too many? Oh.
Thank you, Dr. Weeks.
Please. Similarly, I guess, so, I mean, you think about a university setting, and for a traditional student, there's a ton of resources that are available for all the students to participate or partake in. And then you start kind of adding the different layers of identity and different layers of diversity, and it kind of changes the equation a little bit. So let's say a African-American male student is on campus. There's inherent kind of issues within the campus culture that could affect that person's academic journey and their adjustment to the university. And so, but hey, you know, there's other African American students on campus. I can probably find a community somewhere. Maybe I can feel connected in different circles. But then I add on another layer of maybe coming from a low SES background. And then that maybe changes, or my coping resources may be already taxed because I'm maybe in an environment where there's not a lot of other people from low SES backgrounds. But hey, I was in college and a lot of the students of color came from low SES backgrounds. So hey, I can probably find a community. I can find a little support network of students who come from similar areas as me, and then we can start kind of building a community and building a relationship. And then, well, what happens if I happen to identify as gay? So then more coping resources, my own coping skills are being taxed as I'm trying to navigate the system. And then maybe the actual resources on campus may be more limited because of this extra layer of identity that I have to deal with, and all the stigma associated with that. And so as you can see, like each layer of our identities changes the dynamics a little bit and could serve to tax our own coping skills, but then also maybe even decrease some of the resources that may be available to us. And then on top of that, if you add on psychological distress or mental illness and the double stigma that's associated with that in a lot of cases, then you can really see how difficult it is for some of our students to feel like they can navigate our system successfully, but then also actually reach out for help. It's like this toxic combination almost that really can cause some really tall barriers. But the flip side, in terms of resilience, I think that, you know, as Dr. Weeks was pointing out, just making it there, you've kind of demonstrated some skills to allow you to reach that position. And because, especially as a person of color, and this is, I'm sure this is true for a lot of other groups, there's almost this hypervigilance about how you're coming across, how people are perceiving you. how they're receiving you, how you're interacting with them. And so you develop this skill of really learning how to read people and pick up on these cues in terms of if this is a safe place or are you welcome here. And so that's a skill in itself in terms of navigating relationships and navigating different cultures you're in. And I think that that can actually serve in a good way or serve you well if it's put in this proper context. I was at a training and there was an admiral in the Navy, and he was talking about the Navy's recruiting practices in terms of diversity. And one of his issues was that he didn't feel like the Navy was targeting a diverse enough population in terms of recruiting officers and potential members of the Navy. And he said something very interesting I'll never forget in terms of just the problem-solving skills that are developed in different areas, because a student from Orange County is going to view the world differently, interact with the world differently, and problem-solve differently than a student from inner-city Detroit, who's also going to approach the world differently, problem-solve differently, interact differently than a student from rural Alabama. And just kind of coming from these different places, different identities, because of the environments we're in, just causes us to think about the world differently, causes us to develop distinct and unique set of skills that can actually serve us well if we come together. And so I think that the resilience piece is huge, and I think it's overlooked a lot because there are huge issues, there are a lot of problems, but I love the fact that we're adding the resilience element because it has to be a balanced picture.
Absolutely, there are sort of these skills that are developed by necessity. Yes, Carla. Yes, Ms. Sherd.
Well, I hope I'm answering the question. I've just been thinking as you were speaking, many deaf people who go to deaf schools or mainstreamed environments. By mainstreaming, I mean there may be one or two or possibly three deaf people in a public school with an interpreter usually in their academic program, or there may be a deaf and hard of hearing program then. One common experience is for them to be required to seek counseling and required to get MS assessment, and every 2 or 3 years. And that is a requirement for them to do periodically. And it becomes a mental health stigma in that I am forced, because of my deafness, to go and sit in with a counselor. Only because I'm deaf. I'm required to have an evaluation periodically. Again, solely because I'm deaf. So oftentimes there's a lot of bullying by hearing peers that happen to deaf people in public schools, where they are picked on, and they accept that as their academic experience, the deaf students do. And many of them, then when they arrive at Gallaudet University, they have a hope of finally fitting in and having equal access, communication access, people signing like them and so forth, and go to the cafeteria and be able to sign with others. And then they can be more accepted by their peers, and they experience that. But oftentimes they arrive at Gallaudet and they realize that actually not everyone signs the same. Everyone's signing abilities and skills are not equal. Some were raised in a more oral environment and have oral skills. Some of them use PSE, which is Pidgin Signed English. And what happens is this cycle then repeats itself at this university where they are amongst deaf peers. And then if they at this point in time, they will no longer go seek counseling, because they will think that going to seek counseling in that environment is the same thing as it was in their high school environment, where they were forced to be evaluated as though they were a science project somehow. And then they are not actually supported by the community that they hoped to be a part of. So oftentimes when I have a student sit with me, the very first question they'll frequently ask me is, "Are you deaf? Are you deaf?" And I said, "Yes." And they go, "You are? For real? There's a deaf person in the counseling field?" And they've never met a deaf counselor in their entire lives, and they're stunned. And at that point in time, it all comes out like a flood, their story. Or conversely, I'll meet someone, an African-American deaf person, who says, "Are you black? You grew up in the black community?" And I go, "Yeah, I did. And yeah, I have a black family, and I'm not the only one." And so, so then again, just being me, being a black, deaf female is enough to help them feel safe, because I could not count the number of black, deaf, female counselors, even there may be 4 or 5 of us, I mean, in the whole country. And so when I came to Gallaudet, I met with certain frustrations, or when students came to Gallaudet and had frustrations, they have met not only me, but other deaf counselors who finally gave them the courage to seek and actually succeed in their help, getting their help.
Thank you.
Can I?
Dr. Abbasi, let me just make sure I get real quick.
Oh,
and then
sorry.
go ahead, Brenda. I want to make sure that's all right. I want to include your voice.
I love hearing everything that you're saying. Thank you so much. And the resilience part, you know, if any of you here are of color and want to get into the psychology field or psychiatry field, you know, I'm someone with serious mental issues, and I'm 2 semesters away from getting my bachelor's degree. And if I can do it, you guys can definitely do it. And I remember going to school in 2003. I was 33 to get my Associate of Arts degree. And I never thought that was going to take me 10 years. But because I was in and out of the hospital during the beginning of that time, it was very difficult for me to, come back to school after taking an incomplete semester. And having to explain, the most difficult thing is explaining why I was out. And I believe that through Disabled Student Services, we have test accommodations, and that's wonderful. That's 15 more minutes that I need to take my exam. But I do think that perhaps there could be a different way of setting up the test accommodations within our colleges and our universities, because maybe proper training of professors and students as well, because it never fails that somebody will always say, right when class is being dismissed, Brenda, don't forget you're taking your test at DSS and I need to fill out your form. And I'm sitting there, I don't feel embarrassed because I really don't care what people think, but I would imagine that someone that doesn't have schizophrenia, where I don't really have much of emotions per se, would care. And I sit there going, well, I don't know if that was appropriate or not. I can't really distinguish that. But some people look at me. Yeah, some people look at me like, what are you testing there? And I think students, too, it's very important to educate students that are not part of Disabled Student Services, because if you can imagine, bullying has been a part of my life for a very long time, for being a woman, for being mixed culture, and for being schizophrenic. And so at school also, some of the kids that are there, I'm 20 years older than them. And it's very difficult sometimes when students start bullying you, and you're a grown adult, and you want to defend yourself, but then you're thinking, wait, I'm supposed to behave like an adult. So I think educating students is very important also, as well as professors and other administration staff, to be able to maybe speak to you privately versus speaking in front of others. But resilience, had I not come back to college, to my junior college, I wouldn't be here today. And I wouldn't be so close to graduating. And I wouldn't be looking at all of you guys going, I can't believe I'm here. And what am I doing here? And how did I get here? Dr. Sachs, which, by the way, the psychologist that opened the world of successful people that had my illness, is a beautiful young lady that graduated from USC. And Dr. Sachs and I had talked about her. She told me about Dr. Sachs. She told me, you know, Brenda, when you finish school, you too can do something amazing. Have you heard of this person? And I said, what? Who? And I think as psychologists, psychiatrists that you will become or are, it's important to tell people like me that there are people like Dr. Sachs, and that we too can do it. I think that's very important.
Dr. Abbasi, did you want to add something on?
I think we can summarize it. So definitely making to college is a point of resilience, but as college mental health providers, we need to look at all the resources, what we can do to sustain that resilience. And I could just simplify it in one word: acceptance. Whatever marginalized group we are coming from, we are all seeking just that one thing, which is acceptance. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. Acceptance and services should not feel like a weapon or a punishment, whether it's therapy or DSS accommodations. It's really horrifying. You know, in a minute we'll start integrating the questions, and we can continue talking about stigma and resilience because we'll never have enough time for that. And I'll also just bring in this other theme of how can mental health practitioners continue to challenge, how can all of us continue to challenge ourselves and increase our cultural competence? So we can speak to that from different angles and different perspectives. Who would like to start? Dr. Leeks?
I think just constant engagement. We're all very busy, you know, my colleagues at the Counseling Center can attest, you know, it's just constant grind, just the day-to-day activities that we all do in our fields. And it's really easy to kind of get to a point where you just kind of just go with the flow. You know, you just get into a routine. And I think just constantly reflecting and pausing and taking moments like this to really reflect on our practices and what we're doing help, you know, just to kind of keep us going. One of the things that the Counseling Center at USC, over at the Engelman Student Health Center, we have a diversity theme each year. And so this year's focus happens to be on African American males, but we've focused on LGBT community in the past, South Asian community in the past, and so in a lot of other different groups. But there's programming throughout the year that really helps provide education on those particular communities. But then also we have time where we sit and reflect on our work and how it impacts us personally. So there's some education components, but then also kind of a personal / professional development component that I think is key. Especially in the mental health field, because we have to pay attention to those things because people are coming to us for help, and we need to really fine-tune our tools, which are ourselves in the room. The other thing is, you know, we go to, you know, hundreds of conferences, it seems like, and even here, and I think that it's really easy to say, you know, that was a good experience, it was pretty cool, I met some nice people, I learned a couple of things. But not be really intentional about how we're going to implement that or incorporate some of the lessons we've learned or some of the information that we've gathered. We were at a multicultural supervision conference at UCLA earlier in the year, and Dr. Shelley Harrell did a presentation, and she was talking about cultural niches and just the various intersecting identities and how they can your own personal cultural niche and how you can find a community within that. And so it was very interesting, and I heard the concept before but never really broken down the way that she did. And the fascinating thing is our staff brought that concept back and actually, you know, incorporated it into all of our training with our trainees. And so the pre-doctoral interns did it, you know, the cultural niche experiment with their practicum students, and some of the senior staff did it as well. And I think that's just a really good example of taking information and not just putting it on the shelf and saying, oh, that's pretty cool, but actually trying to figure out how to incorporate and implement it. So.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead. I think as far as this is concerned, one of the things that I think would help everyone is to just forget everything you've learned. Forget everything your parents have taught you as far as cultures and races and ethnicities. Because the bottom line is, if you don't give a person that you typically wouldn't give a chance to speak to and sit down and get to know them, you might miss out on something really amazing. Right. And for example, me taking the risk of talking to Dr. Sachs, like had I not done that, I wouldn't be here today. And you know, we are people who have issues. We have problems. We grew up with these issues and these problems. And when we seek therapy and counseling and psychiatry, I think at those levels, the colors should just disappear, because when you open someone's brain, there's no color there. And when you open someone's heart or anything that you open internally, there's no color there. And I think it's very important to just forget about the biases and the things that you learned, racisms, whatever it is that you picked up along the way as leading to your professionalism. Because to truly help someone, you have to be able to erase all lines of discrimination. or your own beliefs. And I think that as a therapist, that is really important for people like us, that you guys be able to do that. I think everybody in general, just forget about color.
Dr. Bassi?
I would also like to add, go beyond the media also. Don't always believe what is being put on the news channel. In that regards, it's interesting that the Boston Globe newspaper recently did an extensive research on the Boston bombers. And they found out that the oldest brother was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. And the parents never got him the help that he needed. And I never saw that on any news channel. And they still want to treat it as terrorism, which it is terrorism, but they want to blame fundamentalism and all that, but they keep forgetting to bring in the mental health illness issue in that. That said, I love what Brenda said, that we need to go beyond our comfort zone. We need to unlearn or relearn. There's another thing that is coming out in literature, which is in regards to microaggression and implicit bias, which is disconsciousness. So up till now, we have talked about that our reactions could be unconscious, but sometimes our reactions are due to disconscious. So the distorted beliefs that we all have grown up with. There is a question on, a Harvard question on implicit bias. I would highly recommend everybody go and take that, because the results surprised me, because all of us think we are not racist or we don't have any prejudices. So taking that really opened my eyes to my own limitations. As a therapist, we always talk about transference and counter-transference. So we have to be, as providers, we have to be careful with what we are bringing to the session. So I would say.
Absolutely. Dr. Weeks?
So just one comment. First of all, I so appreciate all of the comments on the panel. Just one experience, personal experience, just to complicate life a little bit. So I remember when I first, when I first started undergraduate in Boston, one of my professors, in a very kind and supportive effort, asked me how it felt to be an underserved student at the university. And I said, well, I went to school in Beverly Hills, so it really depends on what you mean by underserved, right? And so just a complication, right? I'm not the, right? I am a black woman. I am a depressive experience. Right? I'm not, right? And to some extent, when you think about things like implicit bias, like we all have schemas, right? You have to create categories in your mind just to survive in an ever-changing world, right? So in some ways, to appreciate that those schemas exist for a reason, right? It helps you to categorize when you have to keep making decisions and you can't get all the information at the same time, right? So those are going to exist. But again, being intentional and mindful about the schemas that you have developed and whether they're actually effective, whether they're actually accurate, and where they get you into trouble. I think it's that level of complication, because I worry a little bit when we move all the way in the other direction and we say, forget the fact that I'm a black woman. So I'm actually offended when my colleagues say, oh, I didn't even notice you were black. Well, really? Right? What marginalized group are you from, right? That doesn't make sense, right? So this idea of being able to have an appreciation of the categories, because there are parts of my experience that are based on my phenotype, right? Mm-hmm. But also to ask, right? What is it about your phenotype that now impacts how you live your life today? I think just asking those questions and not making the assumption would help a lot.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You sure? No? Okay. Well, let's, perhaps we have some questions from the audience at this point. Yeah, Dr. Granger. And I'm just going to move us to our resources slides while we're going over the questions. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll just ask these, and then Kirsten, you'll decide how they... Okay, the first question is, what is the better alternative to a criminal conviction for a crime committed while experiencing an episode related to a mental illness. So an alternative to a clinical conviction. The second, Dr. Broderick Leaks gave the clinical vignette about directly asking what role race and ethnicity play in a person's current mental/emotional state. That was the example of the Latina that you'd used. How often are students in training programs trained to address directly by asking about a client's race and ethnicity? And the third, Dr. Sherd. I want to first genuinely thank you for changing me in a significant and positive way today. I teach psychology, and I think the literature is lacking in the textbooks regarding the deaf community. I vow to include this group in my lectures from now on. Please offer some advice on addressing this community and the corresponding issues within the classroom. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's practice a feminist-style discussion then. And why don't we just, raise your hand if you wanted to comment on any or all of those, and then we'll keep bringing in questions because I just want to make sure this is organic and natural as possible. So any comments on any of those questions?
Well, on the criminal conviction, I hear about nonprofit organizations. I really don't know how they work, but I hear about them all the time. And I believe that with all of the philanthropy and all of the money that our society creates, I believe that by this time we could have created some type of transitional homes for people who are, instead of going to prison, go to a transitional home where they can get their mental illness evaluated and then come up with a report to the courts and saying, this person is not really a criminal. Especially when you think of someone who, at the time, like for me specifically, I worked in human resources. I was making about $60,000 a year. And here I was in this courtroom being convicted of assault. And now that I have some education, to me that sounds ridiculous. How is this HR person assaulting people at 7-Eleven? But at the time, this was back early in 1999, the stigma of mental illness was even bigger than what it is today. And the taboo, and nobody spoke about it. And how could I tell you? I was having an episode. I didn't know that. I really believed I was being followed. And one of the things that I would have loved at the moment is some type of advocacy group that would have come in and said, hey, hold on, this doesn't make sense. This person is working a full-time job every day of the week and goes home and lives a civil life. Like, how is somebody just flipping the script like that? Because pretty much that's what I did. Mm-hmm. And if there was a transitional home, maybe where I can go and my family could take me and be evaluated and probably be given the medication that I needed at the time, I wouldn't now have to explain why I have an assault charge on my record. Mm-hmm. And that would, now that I might pursue going to law school, how am I going to say? I want to be a lawyer and defend the Constitution of this nation and have a crime, a rap sheet. That just doesn't seem right. And I might even be turned down from the Bar Association because of it. But what I'm saying is, just like me, there's others. And let's say you're somebody that is constantly having episode problems and you're constantly getting in trouble. That rap sheet would just get bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where we would have no choice but to never have a job. And I'm sorry, but I want a job. I want to be able to bring income into my household instead of them continuously giving it to me at 43 sometimes. My friends tell me, what point are you going to get a job? Well, at the point that I get one, that people won't care about what condition I have or what is on my criminal record. I think there has to be other means of taking care of people like me when they commit a crime. There has to be.
Well, and backing us up real quick from the intervention part, if we go back to the assessment piece, because I've heard a couple folks, right, Dr. Buzzy, Ms. Scher, talking about how
certain cultural features of our communication or stereotypes may alter the assessment in such a way that it's inaccurate. And then if we consider societal impacts, right, like the school to prison pipeline, right, where certain students who happen to be African American or Latino, usually men, are given disproportionately harsh sentences, both, even at the K through 12 level. Any thoughts on ways, even before we get to the intervention piece, where we could challenge ourselves to improve the assessment piece of this, to get that bias earlier? Any thoughts from the panelists?
Well, like I said, my interview was about 3 minutes long.
Well, that would be a big start.
I don't know. And the questions, I was asked simple questions like if I knew the date. Well, of course I knew the date. This was really, I was like counting down the days that the government was going to get me. Of course I knew the date. And, and so, I really believe that maybe a little bit more of an assessment at that level before you get convicted would be, so attorneys out there, any? Need to really go and get the psychiatrist, let them know this is what we're looking for, Right.
And Dr. Bossi, you had your hand up.
I just wanted to add another resource, which is I think we need to have more of mental health courts and a close collaboration between psychiatrist, psychologist, and a judge. We are trying that experiment in Michigan in regards to more addiction situation. I think that's the kind of model that we really need.
Yeah. Good. And Ms. Sheridan.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you to whomever wrote that comment. I appreciate it. And I do a lot of presentations with Howard University medical students, third-year medical students who are deciding to specialize or haven't yet decided what their specialization. I often speak to them about how to interact with deaf patients. I also work with George Washington University from time to time, again, with their psychiatry residents. I present about, again, deaf patients. And I notice that it's so beneficial. The students leave, they've learned something, they are able to ask questions, and I feel it's a safe place for them to explore that because I let them ask anything. I say there are no stupid questions, and whatever you can, it contributes to your learning. So if any time you're able, when you teach a course, to bring someone, a professional who is deaf or of a professional background, and has a cultural perspective on deafness, it's always incredibly beneficial and awfully nice to hear from a deaf person themselves. It's not the same thing in a training if you have somebody who is not deaf. In order to really understand the person's personal experience firsthand, it's so beneficial. It would be the same as having a white person come and speak of Black history and the Black lived experience. A little bit awkward, yeah. So absolutely the best way is, and also the interpreting department, in order to teach interpreters how to work with deaf patients as well in a given space. If you find any time that you are interested, I have millions of resources, and I think it's a very beneficial thing. I don't want Howard University to be the only university out there that is offering this perspective. I'd like that to spread to multiple universities elsewhere.
Dr. Jabaz, you look like you're about to speak. Did you want to add something?
Oh, I always have something to say. I was just wanted to go back to the mental status exam. I think we definitely need to adapt the scales that we use. As the diversity is increasing in the country, I think we need to reevaluate the scales that we use to assess mental status functioning, like something like you are talking about, the abstract question. I was one day singing the song Junk in My Trunk, and somebody said, Dr. Abbasi, do you know what that means? I said, yeah, it means I need to go and clean my car. So, yeah. So, I wouldn't know, like crying over spilled milk or stuff just an example is like we need to kind of that's why I don't usually just use the standard questions. I'm trying to adapt and always find out. something culturally.
That's a good example.
Junk in the trunk.
Old school classics. So to the question about training, it's interesting. I think that you'd be hard pressed to find a graduate training program that doesn't incorporate some aspect of diversity and how to kind of weave that into some of the clinical work. I mean, it's part of the APA guidelines and just kind of best practices, but I think there's sometimes a gap between kind of what we're supposed to do and then how that gets played out on the ground. And I think it falls a lot to the individual graduate programs, but then also a heavy weight falls onto the individual supervisors that are training the up-and-coming therapists as they're going through their programs. And those are hard questions, you know, and that's why I put the qualifier when I brought it up to the student, because I didn't want to make an assumption. So I was saying, hey, this may not be true for everyone, but I'm wondering if this is kind of part of your experience. And it was a little easier for me to ask that question because of how I identify, and so I could see potential barriers for a person who wasn't a therapist who wasn't of color to ask that question. But I think those questions need to be asked, and so I just encourage supervisors to make sure they're incorporating that into their training, but then also for the therapist in the room to really think about how they can go about trying to incorporate that and actually practicing before the person gets in the room, because once someone's sitting across from you, the game changes a little bit. So.
And I'm wondering, I'm going to call myself. Is that okay if I call? I'm wondering if like backing that up even more, that's going to be my theme, back up. Like on the intake, right? If we're training students and ourselves to do really thorough intakes and using language that's really inclusive from the beginning, if that would be helpful, right? So if we do a really as thorough of a cultural assessment as can be done in the intake and then are continuing that throughout sessions, does that open the door and invite, make a safe space for that? Or, my favorite example is every time I go to the medical doctor, they're like, are you on birth control? And I have a female partner, so I just kind of mess with them a little bit. I'm like, no. And then I watch them kind of like freak out in front of me, And, and then they ask me, what kind of birth control are you using? And I'm like, lesbianism? They don't seem to think it's as nearly as funny as I do. But that's a really clear, just by asking the question, it's an innocent question, that's a really clear thing. Like, I'm making assumptions about your relationship and what kind of risks you have and that kind of thing. So, opening the door at the intake even, are there, and our forms too, right? Do we have male, female, transgender? Do we have race and ethnicity on there? Are we asking about their cultural background, languages, needs for interpreters?
I can only tick mark the other.
Right, so how can we fix that? How can we fix that on intake forms from the moment they walk into the room? So, and you had your hand up, Dr. Boss, I didn't mean to.
I just realized in a few of my cultural competency lectures that I've done lately, let's not inadvertently marginalize the white Caucasian people as well. Sometimes all our focus is so much coming, and that I feel like we are almost making them the other. And a lot of them have their heart and mind in the right place and make great mentors and great clinicians and physicians. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't, in our inclusiveness, we don't leave that out. Another thing I wanted to say, and I'm now forgetting it, so I'll pass it.
Yeah,
sure.
Please, Dr. I just wanted to say I absolutely appreciate that comment, and I often find myself saying I actually like white men, but that's not what I want to say. So what I want to say is I think it is important for us to not leave anyone out of the conversation. I also think it's important not to assume because someone looks a particular way, either as client or as therapist, that they are going to have your best interest at heart, right? So an assumption is often made because I look a particular way that if you're a student of color, specifically if you're a black female student, I'm going to be in the best position to understand, and I'm going to be in the best position to serve you. And that's not necessarily true. And so part of this question of, again, that complexity of knowing where the individual is coming from on both sides. Having said that, I feel quite strongly that there is something about looking at someone who looks like you, who has had the experience that you have had, who speaks the language you speak. So I also don't want, again, for us to pull so far in the other direction that we don't appreciate that there's something we all need to learn, and there's an openness we all need to have about serving diverse populations. But there is something, at least for some individuals, for some students, for some clients, that's really powerful about looking across the table, about looking across the classroom, and seeing a phenotypic role model, right? And so I would ask many of you, sort of what do your counseling centers look like, not only with regard to the forms and the diversity of the questions you ask and the cultural competency, but what do they look like phenotypically? Because it's not everything, but it's something.
But several of you have commented on the importance of role modeling and being able to relate on a personal level. Right. Brenda, did you have your...
And there was a test when I was in human resources that we used to give potential employees, and it was called a personality test. And I was wondering if maybe through psychology, maybe there could be a personality test, because through that test we were able to see when people were introverted and extroverted. And sometimes when we saw Latino, a lot of introversion, that kind of signaled to us, but this isn't really an introverted person, is that they've been taught not to speak on things, to be more reserved, like not complain, right? They're not assertive enough. And so that personality test really helped the company that I used to work for hire a team of people that were able to just be an aggressive, because it was sales, so it was very aggressive. And they would pinpoint based on that test who they wanted to hire. And so it didn't even matter what race they were. As long as they had that assertive capability, boom, you're hired.
And does that privilege certain people from...
Right, because, and then in other times, the depression factor, I mean, there's just so many things that test would read, and sometimes it wouldn't be accurate based on the cultural background. It wasn't so much depression, it was that when you say some cultures, for example, for me, my mom, the word love, my mom always told me, you do not use that term loosely. When you love someone, she says, you never say it just to say it. You say it because you truly feel that you would do anything for this individual, whether it be a friend or a lover. And I think love, there's one of the questions on there, it says, I love big parties. Well, I don't love big parties. But let's say someone who that is not culturally adapt to big parties, and they say no, and they'll answer questions like that with the word love. Obviously, they're going to be depressed because they don't love anything. And so that's, I feel, maybe if we take a look at the assessment tests that are taken, for example, I don't know what the MSE, I probably took it thousands of times, but I don't know what that is and what it entails. If I see it, I probably recognize it. But perhaps there's something there gauging something that's not, that needs to be evaluated, is what I'm saying.
Thank you. Ms. Shore, did you have a comment? Yes.
Yeah, there were a couple of things. One thing that Nicole had mentioned earlier, just because I am a deaf black female, that doesn't necessarily mean that I should work with any deaf black female client just because we look the same.
Right.
And for some reason, there are some deaf people that say that I'm not deaf enough. And that's because I went to Howard University and because I can read and write. And I do sign using ASL, but I have a little bit of a blend of English in my signing style as well. And they say that I act like a hearing person. What that means, I have no idea.
Interesting. Isn't that interesting?
So I'm not completely accepted within the deaf community. And some of my clients will sit there and say, I don't want to work with you. I want a deaf therapist. And I'm like, but I am deaf. I've been deaf since I've been 5 years old, I believe, but, that's one thing. And the other thing I was thinking about, if you think of the word autism, has anybody seen or been in contact with that word before? A few hands out there, autism. That's becoming a huge part of the discussion at Gallaudet University, that it was recognized a few years ago. It's similar to the concept of sexism or racism. Autism is a person being oppressed and discriminated because of their inability to hear and speak. So a lot of deaf people have become sensitive to autism. And I think some of the resources out there that are really good for you to look at and read are to actually understand what really impacts this deaf person, what impacts them in their lives.
We only have about 5 minutes left. Okay, so any last parting thoughts from our panelists as we begin to, Dr. Bassi?
I'm almost scared.
Please, go ahead. No.
I just wanted to say one thing, that it's very interesting to me that death does not discriminate, mental illness does not discriminate, but we discriminate. So that's something that's really something we need to go and focus on.
Any other final thoughts?
I have an Aristotle quote.
Sure.
Okay, I found this when I was reading it recently. Aristotle says, and I quote, "But in most constitutional states, the citizens rule and are ruled by turns. For the idea of constitutional state implies that the natures of the citizens are equal and do not differ at all." And that's on his writings on politics. So I think if we forget the politics and just think of equality across the board, we'll be in a better place.
And being good allies to each other.
Yes, definitely.
The last, Dr. Lucas.
I think something Brenda mentioned earlier, and I think Dr. Weeks touched on it, or Dr. Bassi touched on it as well, but this sense of stepping outside of our comfort zone and having contact with various individuals. I was reading this article on stigma, and the article is presenting that there were 3 different ways of kind of reducing stigma. One was protest, which is basically kind of actively trying to change people's negative beliefs about a certain situation. And then there was education, just generally, hey, here's some education about this stigmatized group to try to help provide a broader perspective. And then there was contact, and just kind of just engagement and a personal connection with the people from various groups. And so you touched on it earlier in the sense of stepping outside of our comfort zones, actually just engaging with people. I was at an interfaith dialogue about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And one of the speakers said something so powerful. He says, the reason I do these things is because when I go back home and I hear my community or some of my friends say negative things about, the Israelis, then I can say, well, no, I was in a conversation with this guy, and we connected, and I have these thoughts about him. And so I think if we continue to put ourselves in these situations where we're kind of in contact or engaging with others, we can go back to our communities and say, no, I sat on a panel with Carla, or I sat on the panel with Brenda, and this is my experience, and this is how I can see their humanity. And then hopefully they'll say the same. I sat on the panel with the African American male. and if we can kind of put ourselves in these situations, step outside of our comfort zones, and then we can actually be first reporters and say, I see the humanity, and we can actually accomplish a lot that way. So, yeah.
Any other final thoughts from Ms. Sherd or Dr. Weeks? Okay, well,
I'm happy to leave it at that.
Yeah, that was a lovely thought. Well, just to summarize a couple of themes that have come up then, I was hearing calls for compassion, but also calls to action. And just as much as we wish to refer our clients to culturally appropriate and affirmative assessment and treatment services, and find ways within ourselves to continue to challenge ourselves to lean in and improve our cultural competency with a variety of groups, I'm also hearing a call from our panel for find ways that we can continue to be allies to each other. And are there ways in which all of us here in this room, can take concrete steps and implement some of this and commit to each other and continue to commit to each other even after we finish here today. And on that line, well, I have two thoughts on that. One is, could we, when we finish up, I would love it if we could practice the, is this how you do the applause, like this? Just practice that. So we'll do that in a minute. Before we get to that, let me just ask a quick question. How many of you, like myself perhaps, have been emotionally touched or moved in some way by what you've heard today? Right? How many of us can commit to taking a piece of that feeling with us after we leave today and allow it to continue to sit and to simmer and to move us in different ways? And who knows where that will go, but to stay with that and not feel so quick to change a subject or think about what you got to do, because I can assure you it's going to be there for all of us when we get back. But that feeling, that moment that you had here in that room, that's really important.
along those lines, I really wanted to thank my fellow panelists. I mean, being on a panel like this, it's not exactly like talking about research methods or, psychopathology. I mean, there's a personal piece to this. There's a lot of folks took personal risks in sharing, and I'm so thankful of that and getting to know each other and trusting each other enough to share on that. So I wanted to thank all of them and to thank all of you, and perhaps we could practice our applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsten and the other panelists. That was just wonderful. And if you could take that feeling that you have, both take it with you and write it down on the cards that you have, because the Sachs Institute is committed to continuing this conversation. And we know that you will all get home and this evening or tomorrow will think, gosh, wouldn't that be a wonderful idea? But then your life has taken you over. So if you could just take whatever time you have between now and 5:30 and just write on one of the cards in your seat, here is something you should consider, here is a person you should have, and just leave them in your seats. We will collect those after the conference is over today. So we have a half an hour before our final panel begins at 3:30. Thank you.